Welcome and thank you for coming. I hope that you can all see my screen. So I just want to say thank you, Danny, for the introduction. My name is Heather Brown and I'll be starting off this presentation, and then I'll be handing over to Viviana to discuss the results, and then I'll come back at the end. So what Viviana and I will be discussing today is who is more likely to have become food insecure because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and why this might be, particularly looking at financial vulnerability and social support systems. So in March 2020, government implemented a national lockdown to contain the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. This entailed the closure of all non-essential businesses, schools, nurseries, restrictions on travel, limits on outdoor exercise, and restrictions on social interactions with people outside one's household. And here are just some pictures showing lockdown in Newcastle. This seemingly sudden change in people's lives has led to panic buying in shops, which restricted people's access to food. And the sudden closure of schools and nurseries was a shock to parents' income, as they now needed to feed children 3 meals a day. A voucher system was set up with supermarket chains to ensure that children eligible for free school meals received food, but there were logistical challenges in ensuring all eligible children received vouchers and were able to access food from participating supermarkets, especially in rural communities. So all of these factors led together, as well as the economic shock, led to increasing levels of food insecurity. So what do we mean by food insecurity? So we use the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations definition of food insecurity, which defines people as being food insecure if they're hungry but unable to eat, if they're unable to access sufficient and nutritious food due to lack of money or other resources, or need to rely on food assistance such as using a food bank. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, the coronavirus pandemic was both a health and an economic shock. Because of these, the combined effect of this, there are likely to be an increase in the risk of food insecurity. So, sorry, this is not the most updated version for the slide, but that's okay. There are the direct health risks associated with the virus. These are, and they're the indirect health risks associated with containment measures, such as limited to a stoppage of face-to-face health services, which might increase the health vulnerability of people at risk if they aren't accessing health services, or they aren't identified by health professionals because of a lack of face-to-face contact. And as well, during the initial lockdown phase in the UK, from March to July, the closures of schools and childcare settings may have impacted on children's health, particularly mental health. And there is some evidence, especially in the children aged 7 to 11, that the closures of schools had a direct impact on mental health. And continually rolling lockdowns, such as the new tier system, means that informal care arrangements may need to change, which could also increase the likelihood of food insecurity for those in need. Okay, so the economic shock of the pandemic will affect people's ability to meet daily living expenses and deal with unexpected costs. This is because of decreased opportunity for paid employment. Sorry, I actually went ahead too much. And that leads to lower wages and decreased likelihood of being resilient to future shocks. Women, the greatest economic impact has been on young people, low-income families, women who are more likely to work in retail, hospitality, and customer-facing businesses, which have been impacted by the pandemic. The economic shock of containment measures is going to cause a decrease in economic growth. We already know that recessions are bad for health. This is because recessions lead to rising unemployment or lack of regular work, which then leads to decreasing wages and decreasing income. So people are less able to cope with increased vulnerability and likelihood of food insecurity, and that then subsequently leads to poor health. So for those in need, organizations serving those people, there are additional challenges. So there's the difficulty of coordinating responses between different organizations and having to do most of this virtually. Many of these organizations don't have necessarily the infrastructure or IT skills to do this very easily, as well as dealing with increased demand. And there is also difficulty of making sure that there is appropriate access to culturally appropriate food, and as well for vulnerable populations, making sure that they can access support. So what do we already know about food insecurity since the start of the pandemic? The number of food insecure adults in the UK has quadrupled. So a previous study from the Food Foundation in 2016 identified that approximately 4 million people in the UK would be considered food insecure. So if this is quadrupled, that means approximately now 16 million people are food insecure. And we also know that self-isolating increases risk for food insecurity because it directly impacts on ability to access food, and that more people have become economically vulnerable, which increases the likelihood of becoming food insecure. So what do? We first identify demographic and economic factors or characteristics that increase the risk of reporting food insecurity during the pandemic, and then we explore how increased financial vulnerability and social support influences the likelihood of low socioeconomic families reporting food insecure. And now, Viviana, I'm going to pass over to you.
You're on mute.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So I was saying that we use to explore the questions about the factors that increase the likelihood of becoming food insecure during the pandemic. We use the Understanding Society survey that ran a short survey at the start of the pandemic, of the lockdown, and has continued monthly and will continue until November. And the weights that we're using is the April and the May surveys, and it's about 14,000 respondents. So in these waves, they collected information on food insecurity using the measures that we already discussed. So specifically, did any person in the household report being unable to access healthy and nutritious food, any person in the household being hungry but not being able to eat, and any food bank use in the last 4 weeks. These 4 weeks were already during lockdown. Next slide, please. Okay. So to explore the factors that influence the risk of food insecurity during lockdown, we use logistic regression. And so we look at pre-pandemic factors that might influence food insecurity during the pandemic. And we looked at income level, education level, if the person reported having a disability or a long-term health condition. We looked at the structure of the family, if the family had children, and what age those children were. We also looked at differences by region, but we're not going to discuss those results here because they don't tell us much. They only say that London is very different from the rest of the country. For the next step, we again use a logistic regression because we're interested in seeing what is the relationship between socioeconomic level and food insecurity, and how much financial vulnerability and social support explain that relationship. So what we use for financial vulnerability and social support were measures collected in the COVID survey, so they're at the time of the pandemic, and they refer to questions regarding the ability to pay bills, such as electricity, council tax, and also credit card bills, being furloughed, receiving free school meals, either in the form of vouchers or directly with the school. And in terms of social support, receiving help from grandparents. And there was also a question about receiving help in terms of someone preparing food for you or giving you food. Not specifically who, just saying help with food. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of the results for the first part of the analysis, we not surprisingly found that households that were already on lower incomes before the pandemic at the time of the lockdown were more likely to report all measures of food insecurity. Similarly, those people that had lower education level, either no qualifications or GCSEs, were more likely to report all three measures of food insecurity. Those who were unemployed already before the start of the lockdown, again, were in this case twice as likely as people who were not in the labor force to report being food insecure during the pandemic. And those who had a long-term condition or a disability were 3 times more likely to report on all three measures of food insecurity, and in particular, the measure regarding access to healthy food. And in terms of the structure of the family, we found that families with small children between the age of 0 and 2 years were more likely to report being hungry but not eating compared to families that didn't have children or children that were older. Next slide, please. We also found that those that were less likely to become food insecure during the pandemic were people that were already employed or self-employed before the lockdown. This is compared to people that are not in the labor market, so not actively looking for work. And the people that own their house or had a mortgage compared to people that rented were more likely to report on all three measures of food insecurity. Next slide, please. So overall, a relationship between socioeconomic status and food insecurity. So if you were within the, you were in the lower socioeconomic status, which meant lower incomes, lower education level, and possibly suffer from long-term health conditions, etc., you were more likely to become food insecure. So for the next step of the analysis, we did the regression of food insecurity against education level as a way to proxy for lower socioeconomic status. And so for the first variable, that is access to nutritious food, the question was how much does financial vulnerability, in this case, being able to pay bills, explain the relationship between low education and being able to access nutritious food. And we found that it was about half of this relationship. It's only due to not having cash or being short on cash. But on top of that, we found that access to free school meals was also explaining the likelihood of having difficulties accessing nutritious food. About 40% of the relationship for people with no qualifications and around 30% with people with very basic qualifications. So next slide, please. Okay. So going hungry and not eating, again, we find that being behind with bills, so the financial vulnerability element during the pandemic was explaining an important part of the relationship between being of lower education, which for us is proxying for lower socioeconomic status, and going hungry but not eating. Access to free school meals also explain part of this relationship, this time close to 10%. And for those people with no education, we found that there was a little extra explanatory power from social support in the help of receiving food or getting help with care responsibilities from grandparents. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. And for food bank use, results are slightly different from the other two variables in the sense that in this case, the financial vulnerability variable is still important, but does not explain so much of the relationship between socioeconomic status and using a food bank in the last 4 weeks. But access to free school meals explains about a quarter of the relationship for both the no qualifications group and people with very basic education levels. And so in summary, so first of all, the summary of the first part of the analysis I already mentioned, there was a relationship between lower socioeconomic status and the vulnerabilities that implies, and higher likelihood of experiencing all measures of food insecurity during the pandemic. In terms of what factors during the pandemic helped to explain this relationship, we found that financial vulnerability was an important contributory element to this risk. And between access to free school meals and receiving help from grandparents, we had about a third of explanatory power of this relationship. But of the two variables, the more important one was access to free school meals. Thank you. Back to you, Heather.
Thank you, Viviana, very much. And now I shall just, okay. Sorry, I'm just making sure this is the most up-to-date version because I might actually stop sharing for a minute and open up more recent slides. So please bear with me for a second.
Hi everyone, please wait with us 2 seconds while Heather finds the slides.
Sorry, everyone. For some reason, my computer is not loading up, so I'll just carry on with these slides. So basically, what we had wanted to say was that, as you can see in the policy brief, we gave some recommendations at both the local and national level of how to reduce the risk of food insecurity. So some of the local recommendations that we made are to create local community hubs, potentially at schools or community centers, to provide information, links to support, and potentially health professionals or other representatives from local authorities, so that those families target these in areas of high economic deprivation and where the population is identified at being high risk of food insecurity, to identify those families which are at risk and make sure that they have the support in place so that they don't become food insecure, as well as targeted information at job centres with welfare advice groups and through organizations such as Active Inclusion Newcastle, for example, to make sure that food security is tagged and kind of or mentioned, so that people who are at risk can kind of therefore get the support they need. And then as well, at the central government level, some of our recommendations were to increase support for those families who have had a drop in income, either permanently or temporarily, to at least meet the original furlough scheme of 80% of salary, as well to increase funding for local authorities. That the current funding structure means that those local authorities who have the populations most at need are receiving lower funding. So to increase funding for those who need to support those most at need, especially to help coordinated responses between different groups, and as well to potentially offer free school meals during holidays, as is currently being debated in Parliament, to make sure that all children have access to food all year long, as well as potentially to increase the amount on the healthy voucher scheme, which is currently offered to pregnant mothers and those with a baby less than 1 year old, and possibly to increase eligibility to cover older children as well. But there are very significant challenges. One of these is already mentioned, is the austerity and the decrease in budgets at the local authority level. And this has been worse for those authorities where there is a higher percentage of need. And also that certain areas, such as the northeast of England, came to the pandemic with high rates of unemployment, high rates of poor health, and therefore they're likely to be harder hit by the continuation of the virus and the economic consequences. So therefore, there needs to be regional support and higher support for those areas with greater need. And as well, there's obviously Brexit and what that will do to food access, food insecurity, and economic resilience, especially in areas where there is a high concentration of businesses that will be impacted, not only by Brexit, as well as by continuing containment measures. So areas where there's high concentration of those working in hospitality and tourism and retail. Okay, well, sorry for the technical difficulties, and thank you very much. That is the end of our presentation. And I think we have about 2 or 3 minutes for questions, if anyone has any burning questions before we move on to Neil's presentation.
Heather, I think we're going to move on to Neil's presentation.
Move on to Neil straight away?
Yeah, and then
okay,
we'll have questions at
that's
the end.
great. Okay, so let me start sharing the screen. And introduce Neil. Oh, no, that's the wrong presentation, sorry. Okay, so let me introduce Neil Munslow, who is the Service Manager for Active Inclusion Newcastle City Council, and we'll be now talking about food insecurity from a local authority perspective.
Okay, Hello. Yes, I'm Neil Munslow. I represent one of those authorities that Heather was talking about that have been really hard hit by austerity. And I feel, I suppose, slightly vindicated because I do suffer from that new condition of SSDS, screen sharing deficiency syndrome. So we all suffer from it. And I wasn't as confident as Heather, so I'd asked if she could, because I've had a few scrapes with the screen sharing, and so Heather stepped in for me, and I can see why. She's a natural. So thank you very much for that, Heather. And we click on, and I've got around 15 minutes to try and do some justice to what a lot of really amazing, wonderful people, some of whom are on the call, do to respond to the challenge of food poverty in Newcastle. And I think as the research that Heather went through showed, I don't think it's a surprise to very many of us that poorer people are more likely to suffer food poverty. And that question within that then is, what do we do about it and how can we respond? And particularly for us, it's what's the role of the local state as the national state withdraws, and how do we respond to those structural causes of poverty that are outside of our direct influence. And our response and my presentation will really talk about the wider consequences of poverty, because we want to respond to poverty in the round rather than have a fragmented approach that only responds to food poverty and destitution, the consequences. And our financial inclusion aims are written up there. It's about maximising income in response to the welfare reforms. The welfare reforms create a much higher degree of conditionality, and it's about benefit maximisation. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go through. It's about supporting residents to manage their money. So it's increasing income, reducing expenditure, budgeting and reducing harmful debt. The government's balancing figure for the welfare reforms was employment. It was going to be okay because in Newcastle, the £120 million a year that was taken away from residents would be replaced by work. That hasn't quite happened, but we still want to support and help residents into work. Promoting affordable credit options. When we started this programme, it was very much at the time of Wonga and payday loans, and our councils, when they came into power in 2011, had an ambition of doubling credit union membership, and we've had some really great success then. We've got CreditWise in Newcastle, a brilliant credit union, reducing fuel poverty and promoting access to bank accounts. And in about 18 months ago, we added tackling food poverty. That is now part of the financial inclusion aims of the council because it's so prevalent. Food poverty within 10 years has become part of everyone's lives. So those who were part of it when the UN Special Rapporteur visited Newcastle, Professor Philip Alston, and he quite brilliantly illustrated just how much has changed in the last 9 years, and now food poverty is a part of all of our lives. We see it in our communities everywhere. So Newcastle's response, we want to make a demonstrable difference by making it everyone's business to promote financial inclusion. The council hasn't got all of the resources to respond to everything, but it's the organisation that's got the convening right to try and bring a community together. So we began in 2013 in response to austerity and the welfare reforms, what we call our active inclusion partnership approach. And we call it an approach because it isn't like joining the AA. You don't sign up for it, or the RAC, or any of those things. It's about a way of working together and to try and maximise the value of our collective resources. It isn't the big society. It doesn't just happen. We've got very limited capacity to bring all this together. I'm not sure, because there's too many people for me to see on the thing, if Claire Fish is here, but Claire Fish essentially is that capacity. It does an incredible job of bringing a lot of people together to maximise the value of our collective investment. And what we want is to do everything we can to support residents to have the foundations for a stable life, somewhere to live, an income, financial inclusion, and employment opportunities. We don't really claim to do much more than seek to stabilise, to mitigate. I think it would be grandiose for us to claim that we can offset the scale of the challenges that residents face, but we can hopefully knock off those harder edges. So if we could click forward, please, Heather. And this slide kind of tries to capture some of that challenge of how we try to bring this partnership approach and our together and our aims. So our primary aim is prevention in the shorter term sense. It's not in this context, we're not using it in like about education and long-term prevention. We are talking about preventing homelessness and destitution, pretty limited aims. And we bring together around 134 partners in Newcastle. We have 3,721 subscribers for information. We trained 860 people last year, and almost 70,000 people accessing information through our website. And I haven't got the statistic to hand, but I think in the pandemic, the information that Clive Davis from the Welfare Rights Service provides, there was something like a 200% increase in access to that information. When the preventative approach, when information isn't enough, we seek to provide direct advice. So around 30,000 residents advised in Newcastle, 3,745 cases of homelessness prevented, 23,000 residents helped to secure almost £29 million. So that's that maximising income. 3,853 residents helped with debt advice. And in crisis, when it all goes wrong, because it's not a statutory function, we don't know very much about food poverty at its worst. We do know about homelessness, which is a statutory function. So we know that when the state fails, people become homeless. And part of linked to those green, yellow, and red people is perhaps an idea of the different roles of the state. So the national state primarily is responsible for those structural issues, the provision of welfare benefits, health services, those big national institutions. The local state is predominantly responsible for resilience, helping people when something goes wrong. So intervening, providing advice, providing support. And I think that very much matches the research that Heather and Viviana presented on those people who don't reach the red area, the safeguarding thresholds where the state has to provide somebody with accommodation, or maybe even has to take their children away when things have got so bad, they can't survive in the market, they can't survive with information, they can't survive with the provision of advice and support that builds resilience. They have to, the state has to step in. And it's those people at that resilient stage, there are more people in that need, and that match across to low-level education seems to be very pertinent. So if we could click on, please. This next slide shows something of the challenges, how those factors that Heather and Viviana explained, how they play out in Newcastle. So £120 million loss of working age benefits, £327 million reduced budget, along with around 32 million additional coronavirus cuts that the council has seen. That loss of welfare benefits, work didn't replace it for the vast majority of people who have disadvantaged. Debt replaced it, and we see that in the increase in rent arrears, increase in council tax arrears. And Newcastle was the first major city to have the rollout of universal credit. And we've now got, or at the 13th of August, just under 34,300 residents on universal credit. And you'll see the coronavirus related spike, 11,267 additional people onto universal credit between 12th of March and 13th of August. On the other side are our known responses. it's difficult for us to be absolutely conclusive, but because we don't know and don't gather every information from everybody. We know what the council's own services provide, and we encourage partners to align their services with us, but we don't know everything. But we do, of what we know, 3,745 cases of homelessness prevented. And those are opportunities, I think, because I've mentioned those other figures before, but the discretionary funding awards, where people haven't got a right to funding, but they can ask. Those are those opportunities that maybe we can better case find, we can better respond to, that link to the research that Heather and Viviana have presented. So when somebody has to get discretionary housing payment, when they have to get a crisis support scheme because they're destitute, those are our opportunities. And at the bottom, there's two figures, which I think are the figures that we're perhaps certainly most proud of, that since 2008, out of our 26,000 council homes, got a 75% reduction in evictions. This is something the state can do, the local state can do, to respond to those challenges residents face through poverty. So we can extend our forbearance. We do, and on the 20th of July, the council and YHN, our landlord, Your Homes Newcastle, agreed that we would have an approach of no evictions into homelessness. And so we move from collection to connection. We see these as opportunities to better support residents rather than the conditionality that they bear the consequences of their hardship and the failure to pay their rent. That figure at the bottom again shows how the cities come together. And unlike a lot of other core cities, we've managed to have a significant reduction in rough sleeping. 82% of those instances where we found people rough sleeping, we have a daily count of people going out looking for people. And that's very different in the other core cities. Most, I think Manchester was 54, Nottingham was 31 in people in a day. Our average is 1. So there is something about Newcastle as a Goldilocks city coming together. If we could click on, please. So this slide here just illustrates that point, that even after really professionalized debt advice, where somebody goes through somebody's income and expenditure in detail and matches that to their rights, we see that around 36% of budgets are unsustainable. Some are propped up with short-term discretionary funding, but that poverty is the root cause. So a huge proportion of people now have unsustainable budgets, and that gap is partly filled by debt and it's partly filled by food banks. And if we could click on, please. So I won't go through all of this in detail, but this is just illustrates how we seek to come together to meet those challenges. Some of those numbers, so the maximising income, you can see partners and agencies coming together to ensure that people, as much as possible, get their benefits that they're entitled to, the welfare benefits, supporting residents when they face debt. You can see that very low numbers on training. That's partly because we don't get all of those numbers recorded because, again, it's not a statutory right. And if we could click on, please. So affordable credit, you can't see the beginning figure, but you can see it has, credit union membership has doubled. We've got agreements with the hospital trust, with I think even the university, I'm not 100% sure, but where there's agreements with the payroll scheme so that people can have pay deducted directly into the credit union. And I would encourage anybody, I'm not quite sure of the income of the people who are on the call, but either if you lead alone or you want a place to save your money because interest rates are so low elsewhere, and you want your money to be beneficially used for those who've got less money than you, then join the credit union. Reducing fuel poverty, and you can see those numbers there, and tackling fuel poverty, tackling food poverty. That is just, that's what the council, so the council has a crisis support scheme where just under £23,000 of money was awarded, but it cannot be awarded. It can only be awarded when people are in crisis rather than just in poverty, because the fund isn't sufficient to respond to poverty and make up the 120 million that was taken away in benefits and food bank usage. And you can see the 2019 figure there of 21,000 households helped through the food bank. If we could click on, please. So in 2017, we established our Food Poverty Network Group, representation from the organisations listed there and others as well. The aim is to support and coordinate action around food poverty. So food poverty has grown a lot faster than any infrastructure or support to respond to it. It really is being a voluntary response. And our aims are to understand and respond to those causes of food poverty, support coordination of holiday hunger in Newcastle, support the delivery of the food power programs, support those initiatives, those disparate fragmented initiatives that are funded from different parts of government money to help people to access the limited support that is available, and consider those opportunities to work together to develop the support and the pathways that can help people to build more resilience. I'm slightly wary of navigation and pathways type models, because I know in health services very keen on having navigation type models and pathways that take people away from health services. But when I would rather us work much more closely in collaboration with health services, so that rather than having a pathway to a service that might have been cut because the funding wasn't there, we have less navigators and more services, would be my call to anybody who's in control of any health funds here. And if you want to be part of our food poverty group, there's Claire's email address and you can contact Claire. And if we could click on, please. Conscious, thank you. So one of the first things we did, and you can see that on the Information Now website, Claire did an amazing piece of work in trying to map all of the emergency food provision in Newcastle. And the stimulus for that, I remember Sandra Bryden, who's one of the partnership managers at the job centre, contacted us and said, I think the West End Food Bank was closed on a Friday. Where could they send somebody from the job centre who didn't have anything to eat? And we were, because it's not a statutory provision and it's done by volunteers, some things are open on different days and not on other days. So it's worth having a look at Information Now to see how that emergency free food in Newcastle is mapped out, and at least the information is there now for people to access it. A City Lifeline, a response in the coronavirus, and that you can see there, targeted offers of support to people who couldn't get out, who were suffering from food poverty there. The West End Food Bank, 4,873 food parcels in May, a 250% increase on the year after. And the food bank, I can't do it justice here, I'm already running over a little bit, but adapted is what it does to meet the circumstances in a way that I think only a kind of brilliant voluntary sector organisation can do. Home deliveries, and now building on their great reputation and developing some of the Pathways Out of Hunger project, trying and working with the council and other organisations to help build the people who use the food banks resilience and reduce their need to use the food bank. And examples there, Newcastle was successful in the bid for the Best Ever Summer, so again some additional funding to offset food poverty campaigning, along with the North East Child Poverty Commission. Amanda wrote to the government, and we support that initiative where the government are replacing hot meals with packed lunches and trying to stop that, and then disseminating some of the funds that have come through the DEFRA's emergency assistance. And if we could click on, please. There we go. And this is a slide from the West End Food Bank, and I think it illustrates what they do, taking that opportunity to respond to people in really difficult circumstances, and then to engage with those people to help them both in that immediate crisis, but then to reduce the likelihood of further crisis. And I think it's pretty famous across the country, the West End Food Bank, for all kinds of good reasons. And I think, you know, the council's incredibly proud to work with and to support them. And it's not just great at responding to the crisis of food poverty, but it's also a great organisation to work with to try and reduce future crisis. And if we could click on, please. This slide relates to one of our aims, and that certainly I think relates to some of the examples that Heather and Viviana were giving there, of where people are in greater levels of disadvantage. Those people with low-level education, don't reach social care thresholds, aren't quite in crisis. So we established a multidisciplinary team, particularly in response to the welfare reforms, the bedroom tax and the benefit cap in particular, that uses case finding. So rather the traditional model, state model, is something's gone wrong in somebody's life, they knock on the council's door or a voluntary sector's organisation's door and say, help me. This group of workers work as a team. Great, we've got a brilliant partnership with our local job centre. They are part of it. Your Home's Newcastle, our early help service, welfare rights and debt advice. And they go and they knock on the doors and they send emails and they do everything they can to get to those people at the sign of a point of crisis when poverty's hitting. So particularly the benefit cap is the biggest example, where mainly single parent families lost up to £150 a week just overnight. It was Boxing Day 2018, and a huge income shock that would have led to homelessness. And this team supports those families, and it provides some hope, because whilst losing hundreds of pounds a week through benefit cuts, through the provision of that range of advice there, we've seen that people actually end up with more income and less expenditure because of particularly taking debt away from buying off debt from things like Bright House and high cost furniture, and replacing that with furniture that's been provided through the council. That and rebalancing people's payments is really does help people. So we can do some good. And if we could click on, please. This was my take on ask for what would our 5 policy areas be. So improving the understanding of the causes of food poverty. And I think that's why it's great that the university is running this program. It helps us to understand this structural resilience building and safeguarding responses. How can we do those things better together? Testing and reviewing the effectiveness of our responses. So that's what our food poverty group does. That's what our quarterly financial inclusion review, chaired by our deputy leader, Councillor Joyce McCarthy, who provides that visible political leadership, developing those proportionate partnership responses, working with food poverty charities to do that. So see those examples there of how we can respond in different ways to different people's circumstances. The reviewing our debt collection and discretionary funding processes, that moving from collection to connection and maximizing the value of our touch points. So when something goes wrong in someone's life, and that's illustrated through debt and poverty, we don't use that as an opportunity to penalize, we use that as an opportunity to help. And consolidating our partnership approach, the infrastructure, and getting some of the resource for the infrastructure required for the coordination at the strategic partnership and case levels. And if we could click on, please. I think I've overrun, I'm sorry. And finally, a plea really. I don't know how many of the people who are on the call are in that group where they haven't got sufficient disposable income. I suspect most people here have, and if you have got any disposable income, please will you text 88802 with the message donate food, and join the Newcastle fans who instead of paying Sky pay-per-view donated £20,000 to the West End Food Bank. I think today's seminar is free, so you know, treat this as your payment for the seminar. Make a donation to the food bank, please. And that's it from me.
Hello everyone, my name's Holly-Ann Carl and I'll be leading the Q&A session today. So if I can ask all of our speakers to turn their cameras on in preparation to answer the questions. The first question is aimed at Heather and Viviana, and it is, have senior citizens, especially the homebound, been disproportionately affected by food insecurity?
You're still on mute, Viviana.
It's because I have the baby sleeping next door. I don't know what's suddenly. Sorry. Yeah, so in our data, we don't specifically look at the senior citizens, but we do see that those who are suffering from disabilities or long-term health conditions, so more likely to be homebound, are people that are the most likely in our results to report food insecurity, and specifically issues with access to healthy and nutritious food.
Would anyone like to add to that before I move on to the next question? No? The next question is, to what degree did those who were already in food insecure situations end up worse off, i.e. a question of food insecurity intensification versus population prevalence?
Okay, so I guess a problem with the data, and I guess with this secondary analysis in particular in the UK, is that in most of the large surveys, they don't ask about food insecurity. So, but this COVID survey for Understanding Society was an exception. So we actually do not know the extent really of food insecurity before COVID in the population we use, or in fact, the general population that was taken from a survey by the Food Foundation. So in a sense, we're not sure. They have asked in wave 4, so that was taken, so it's April, May, June. In July, they have re-asked the questions on food insecurity. So what future analysis we plan on doing is looking at people who were food insecure at both time points, people who became food insecure between those 2 time points, and kind of what might be driving that. But that's kind of a separate paper to what we've done before. So we plan on working on that over the next year with a master's student. Do you have anything to add, Viviana?
No, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Heather. The next question is, when are you expecting a write-up of the research from Understanding Society survey data logistic regression analysis to be available?
Well, we're currently writing up the paper, and I'm hoping we'll have it finished before Christmas. So sometime either end of this year, early next year.
Brilliant. The next question is, Newcastle is a college town. Has the food insecurities of college students increased?
I don't know if Neil would like to answer that, perhaps.
I would imagine so. I think, like Heather said, there isn't baseline information. The food banks don't keep and record ever so detailed information about everybody who uses them. I don't know if the universities do. So this is an information issue, that because this isn't a right and a state response, we have to make proxy measures. So I don't know. I expect so.
The next question is for Neil, and it is, to what extent is the work of the council locked in with the third sector providers? That is, to what extent will your response need to change if charity non-profit provisions change?
It's locked in as much as we can. So that's where bringing those 134 organisations together, trying to create a coordinated approach, providing funding through things like the Newcastle Fund, through supporting applications that organisations have to secure other trust funds, and trying to align the provision that the council and particularly Your Homes Newcastle, our landlord, has with other charitable provision. But it's a challenge to do. It doesn't just happen because it's a competitive market situation. Lots of small organisations competing against each other. But we have a convening role, an information providing role, and trying to maximise that value of collective investment and have, I suppose, a more of a community-based than a competitive approach, which is kind of hardwired into a lot of the English system. So we do work very well. I would hope, I know there's colleagues on this seminar from the third sector, and I guess they'd be better placed to answer than me, but we try hard to work in partnership, hence holding things like the food poverty group.
Just going to ask one final question before we move into the breakout rooms, which is, how can the stigma about using food banks be reduced in communities?
Shall I have it?
Yes, please.
Go. I mean, I think one of the frightening things is that the more things become normal, the less they become stigmatized, and that's quite scary. That it is becoming a commonplace. I think, you know, most of us might know somebody who knows somebody who uses a food bank, and that's pretty awful. The other thing, I think, is by place-based approaches, by being aware of the structural impact of things like the Localism Act, of the welfare reforms, those things that happen through national policy that change local minds, and trying to have a place-based approach. And it would be great if, to be with the university that says this is how we view each other in Newcastle. We don't necessarily have to have the same view as comes from central government. So it's about trying to create that local culture. I think that example that's up on the slide there, the John from the food bank, John McCrory, told me that I think YouTube, because of their link with the Premier League, have now stopped sharing all the videos of the Newcastle fans that said they don't stigmatise the people who use the food bank. They are donating, they are giving them money, they are supporting. Yeah, I think that is a great illustration of what a lot of people in Newcastle are like. Lots of people do not stigmatise, they support, and we need to recognise this, you know, and build on the strengths of in our communities, and perhaps focus on that more than the negatives and the things that may come out of the national media.